In the autumn of 1889, the earth began to move on Martha's land. It wasn't from a tremor or a slide. It was the steady, relentless rhythm of her shovel. Day after day, from sunup to sundown, Martha worked alone, a lone figure against the vast and indifferent northern plains. The prairie grass had turned golden, with the sky holding the sharp, crystalline blue that promised the cold was coming. Her homestead, a small, sturdy cabin nestled into the land, was all she had left after Thomas, her husband, had died the year before. A fever had taken him suddenly, leaving her to carry on, alone. Thomas had built the cabin strong, with deep foundations meant to survive the harsh winters, but he never lived to see the real test of his work. He left her with the cabin, the land, a couple of horses, a milk cow, and a silence that was louder than any storm. Now Martha was digging, not digging for a root cellar, there was already one beside the cabin, not digging for a well since the creek ran steadily just 50 yards away. No, Martha was digging a hole, a great rectangular pit right behind her home, the earth slowly rising beside it into a mound that looked like a small hill. Her hands were raw and her back ached, but she didn't stop. A preacher passing through on his way to the next settlement had watched her from his horse a week before. He had seen her digging, slow, unbroken rhythm, and had wondered if she needed help. She'd paused, wiped her brow with a gloved hand, and shaken her head. Without a word, he had ridden off. He assumed grief had clouded her mind. She wasn't building a barn, she was digging her own grave. Alastair Finch, the region's wealthiest rancher, had heard the stories of the widow and her strange project. A man who built barns from timber and stone, who believed in the ways of the land that had always worked. Finch wasn't sure what to make of Martha's pit. So he rode out to see for himself. On a brisk October morning, his fine black gelding trotted across the hardened earth to the Collins homestead. When he arrived, he found her still digging, the hole now 12 feet deep and 40 feet long. It startled him. This wasn't the work of someone grieving. This was the work of a woman who knew exactly what she was doing. He dismounted and walked up to the edge of the pit. "Mrs. Collins," he said, his voice a mixture of command and concern. "A word, if I may." Martha paused and stood, leaning her shovel against the earth. She looked up at him, her face unreadable, her eyes shaded by the brim of her sun-worn hat. She didn't speak. "This is impressive work," Finch continued, his eyes scanning the deep pit. "But it's misguided. A barn must be built above the ground. It must have thick walls to block the wind, a pitched roof to shed the snow. That's how it's always been done." Martha's silence was enough. Finch continued, pressing on. "The ground freezes in winter. The spring thaw will flood this pit. The walls will collapse. You're building a tomb for your animals, not a barn." Finally, Martha freed her shovel and stepped to the edge of the pit. She didn't look at Finch, but rather at the vast horizon behind him. "The earth holds heat," she said, her voice low, steady. "It remembers the warmth of the summer." Finch almost laughed. It sounded like something an old woman would say, some old drifter with too many years spent watching the land. "That's just folklore, Mrs. Collins. The earth does remember. You're risking everything on a feeling." "I'm risking everything if I don't," Martha replied, her voice unwavering, her gaze still fixed on the endless expanse. Finch stood there for a moment, watching her, trying to read the woman in front of him. She wasn't listening to his logic or his reputation. She wasn't even paying attention to his advice. She was listening to something else, something deeper. Finch mounted his horse, his words fading into the distance as he turned back to leave. "Folly," he muttered under his breath. "Tragic folly." The word spread quickly through the settlements, Collins's folly. They whispered about the woman digging a hole into the earth, alone and mad with grief. The gossip was swift, cutting, and cruel. A woman alone on the plains was a fragile thing, they said. Her grief had broken her mind. She was building a tomb, not a barn. Alastair Finch, after all, was the measure of success in these parts. A man like him knew how things should be done. His way was the only way. Martha's rejection of his counsel made her an outcast. No one understood why she was doing it. In the towns, in the general store, men leaned against counters and whittled their pieces, talking in low voices. Some of the women spoke behind their hands. They worried about her. Her refusal to let anyone help her was seen as a sign of madness, not strength. She didn't care about their whispers. The offers of help, conditional and patronizing, were always politely turned down. Her work now was her own, and she was determined to finish it. As she dug, day after day, her hands grew rough, her back sore. The rhythm of her labor was all-consuming. She didn't see it as crazy or foolish. To her it was simple. The barn wasn't just for her. It was for her animals, the ones she had left. They were all she had, and she would protect them at all costs. As the months passed, the prairie grew colder, and Martha's work continued, relentless and single-minded. The wind began to howl across the plains with a chill that seemed to bite deeper with each passing day. The first frost came early, and the earth she had so carefully shaped hardened beneath the weight of the creeping cold. The townspeople watched with a mixture of pity and derision as Martha dug, alone. There were whispers that her mind had unraveled with her grief. Her refusal to accept help was seen as a clear sign of her madness. But still, she worked, cutting through the cold, the shovel biting deep into the frozen earth, each scoop a defiant strike against the landscape that had claimed her husband and left her alone. The sound of the shovel striking the earth was all she could hear, one rhythmic thud after another. Her hands were calloused and cracked, her back bowed from the weight of the work. But there was no pause, no moment of hesitation. She was building something bigger than a barn. She was creating her sanctuary. The walls of the pit grew higher with each passing week, and the pile of earth beside it swelled into a mound. The barn, as she saw it, was not a structure of timber and stone. It was a home, an ark, a vessel of survival. The work was exhausting, but it wasn't just the physical toll that drained her. It was the loneliness, the quiet of the plains that pressed against her. With every shovel of dirt, she felt the weight of isolation. The world she had once known had disappeared when Thomas died. She had felt his loss in every room of the cabin, in every corner of the land. But now, in the silence of her labor, she found something else. She found peace. The animals, her 2 horses, Clementine and Jasper, and Daisy, her gentle Jersey cow, watched her with quiet eyes from their small corral. They didn't question her. They didn't whisper behind her back. They simply existed as she did. She fed them, cared for them, and watched as they grew strong on the food she provided. They were her family now. Their survival was all she cared about. The barn was for them. It was for her protection as much as theirs. She had learned to read the land in a way no one else could. Over the months, she had carefully observed the animals around her, especially the prairie dogs. She had seen how their burrows stayed warm in the winter, how the frost never penetrated more than a few feet into the earth. Below that line, the earth held a constant temperature, one that remained steady, even in the harshest winter. It was this knowledge, this quiet wisdom that guided her hands. The land, she knew, could protect her, if she knew how to work with it. Her method was simple but revolutionary. After she had dug the main pit, she began to line the walls with field stones, hauling them from the creek bed a wheelbarrow at a time. She fit them together, using a mortar of clay and straw to seal the gaps. Each stone was placed carefully, each piece of the puzzle fitting into place as she had envisioned it. The walls were thick and solid, meant to hold the heat of the earth against the cold of the coming winter. For the roof, Martha salvaged heavy timbers from a collapsed section of creek bank, dragging them back to her homestead in the dead of night when the moon was high and the air still. She placed the timbers across the top of the pit, leaving a narrow opening at one end for a ramp. Over the timbers she laid sod, thick, heavy layers of prairie grass that would insulate the barn from the biting cold. The sod roof would blend into the landscape, a part of the earth, not a structure sitting above it. The ramp leading down into the barn was long and gently sloped, wide enough for the horses to walk down without fear. She built the walls strong and the roof solid, but it was the ventilation that became her greatest concern. She knew that a sealed underground space would become foul and damp. So she created ventilation shafts, 2 holes bored from the ceiling of the barn to the surface. These holes were lined with hollow logs and surrounded by carefully arranged rocks to keep snow and rain out while allowing the air to circulate freely. The barn would be a living space, not just for her animals, but for the life-giving air they needed to survive. As autumn bled into the gray stillness of November, the weather began to change. The first snowflakes fell, soft at first, then heavy and wet, blanketing the earth in white. It was time. The animals had to be moved into their new home. Martha led them to the ramp, her lantern held high to guide the way. The horses, Clementine and Jasper, hesitated at the top, their hooves crunching on the cold earth, their eyes wide with uncertainty. The scent of earth and stone filled the air, and the darkness of the opening seemed too foreign to them. But Martha spoke to them in soft, calming tones. She walked down first, the lantern swinging in her hand, casting flickering shadows on the stone walls of the barn. Slowly the horses followed, their hooves clicking on the ramp, their breath clouding in the cold. Behind them Daisy, the cow, ambled down, her calm demeanor a contrast to the uncertain pace of the horses. Once inside, the world changed. The wind, which had been a constant companion outside, disappeared. The air was still and cool, but not biting. It was the coolness of a cellar, a place that was both dark and safe. The animals settled quickly, their initial hesitation fading as they found fresh hay to nibble and clean bedding to lie in. They were safe from the cold. They were sheltered. Martha climbed back up the ramp, closing the trap door behind her. She stood in the warmth of her cabin for a moment, feeling the peace settle over her. Her home had become more than a house. It had become a fortress, a sanctuary from the storm that was coming. The storm did come, but it was nothing like anyone had expected. The blizzard that swept across the plains in January of 1890 was like no other. The wind howled with a fury that bent the trees and shook the very earth. Snow fell in thick sheets, covering everything in a blanket of white. The temperatures plummeted to 20 degrees below zero. Martha was ready. The animals were safe. The barn held steady beneath the earth, protected by the land itself. Martha had done what no one else had thought possible. She had outwitted the storm, not by fighting it, but by working with it. While the rest of the world was being consumed by the blizzard, Martha and her animals remained untouched, safe and sound in the underground shelter she had built with her own hands. The storm howled on for days, a monstrous beast that seemed to tear at the very fabric of the world. The wind shrieked through the frozen plains, bending trees and burying fences under mountains of snow. By the third day, the world outside had vanished completely. The landscape was no more than a swirling, featureless sea of white. It was as if the land itself had been erased, leaving only the endless, bitter snow. Inside her cabin, Martha sat by the fire, listening to the storm. The walls of her cabin creaked and groaned under the weight of the snow that piled higher with every passing hour. The roof, built strong by Thomas, was holding, but Martha could feel the strain. She could hear the wood cracking as the snow pressed down on the timbers, a steady reminder of the danger outside. She could feel the tension in the air, a constant reminder that the storm was not just a blizzard, it was a reckoning. It was nature itself testing everything, stripping away the fragile safety nets that humans had built for themselves. But Martha knew deep down that the storm was not her enemy. The storm was just another part of the land, another challenge to face, another test of her resolve. She stood and walked to the trapdoor, her breath misting in the cold air. She lifted it slowly, not out of fear but out of necessity. She had to check on her animals, make sure they were safe. She had built this barn, this sanctuary for them, and it was her job to protect them. The quiet stillness from below greeted her as she descended the ladder. The barn, tucked into the earth, was a world apart from the chaos above. The cold outside was shut out here. The air was still and cool, a perfect sanctuary. Clementine and Jasper stood calmly in their stalls, chewing hay, their large eyes watching her every movement. Daisy, the cow, lay curled up in her bedding, chewing her cud with the same placid expression. They were all alive. They were all well. Martha moved through the barn, checking on each of them, making sure their bedding was fresh, their food plentiful, their water full. She could hear the wind howling above her, but down here in the earth's embrace, there was only peace. The temperature in the barn had remained steady, 38 degrees just above freezing. Not warm, but comfortably cool, just as she had planned. The ventilation shafts, which she had worried might freeze, were working perfectly, drawing in air from the surface and keeping the barn fresh and dry. For the first time since the storm began, Martha felt a flicker of something like hope. The land had answered her question. It had provided. It had taken her knowledge, her work, her faith in the earth and turned it into a fortress. She wasn't just surviving the storm. She was thriving in it. The horses, the cow, and she herself were safe. She was sheltered from the worst the world had to offer. Up above, the storm raged on. The snow was now so deep that it completely covered the cabin, leaving Martha feeling like she was in the belly of the earth, isolated, cut off from everything else. But down here in the barn, it didn't matter. There was nothing else she needed. There was no one else she needed to prove anything to. She had done it. She had built the perfect shelter, one that would protect her animals from the cold and the wind, one that would keep them alive while the rest of the world succumbed to nature's fury. The days blurred together as the storm showed no signs of stopping. The wind continued to scream outside, the snow falling relentlessly, but inside Martha's sanctuary there was peace. She cooked her meals over the fire, ate in the solitude of her cabin, and then descended to the barn again, checking on the animals, making sure they were all right. It was during these trips down into the barn that Martha realized something even more profound. She wasn't just surviving this storm. She was thriving in it. Her quiet wisdom, born from loneliness and hard work, had carried her through when everyone else had been caught off guard. The animals had thrived as well, their coats full and healthy, their eyes bright, their bodies well fed. Outside, men were struggling. Finch, the proud rancher who had once dismissed her idea, had not prepared for this storm in the same way. His barn had been built to withstand the blizzards of the past, but nothing could have prepared him for the ferocity of this one. His cattle, his prize horses, and everything else he had worked for were at the mercy of the storm. No amount of timber or stone could have saved them from the might of the earth's wrath. It wasn't long before the rest of the town realized that Martha was not just lucky. She had outlasted them all. While their barns collapsed under the weight of the snow, while their animals froze in the cold, Martha's underground sanctuary remained untouched. The storm was relentless, but her design had held. The sound of the wind was deafening, but inside the barn, the only noise was the soft crunch of hay and the occasional shuffle of hooves. She checked the temperature once more. The mercury in the thermometer hovered just above freezing. Martha had succeeded. The storm had done its worst, but her barn, her creation, had withstood it all. The prairie, once so vast and empty, now felt like home. And in that moment, Martha knew she had made the right choice. She had listened to the earth and trusted in it. In a world where so many relied on tradition and the wisdom of men, Martha had listened to something deeper, something older, the land itself. While the rest of the world fought the storm with fire and blankets, with prayers and desperate measures, Martha and her animals waited it out, sheltered in the earth, protected by the wisdom of a woman who had learned to listen. By the fourth day of the blizzard, the storm finally showed signs of relenting. The wind slowed to a whisper, and the snow, once fierce and blinding, began to settle. The world outside was still buried, but the air no longer howled with the same ferocity. The oppressive weight of the snow and ice remained, but the worst had passed. Martha stood in the dim light of her cabin, watching as the first rays of weak sunlight began to push through the cracks in the snow outside. Her small window, still partially blocked by the drifting snow, gave a glimpse of the white wasteland beyond. The calm after the storm felt almost surreal. The wind, which had once felt like it would tear the world apart, now seemed a distant memory. Everything was still, silent, peaceful, and yet Martha knew that the silence meant nothing. It was only the quiet before the real work began. She moved slowly, feeling the weight of the past few days settle into her bones. There had been moments, especially on the third night, when fear had crept into her thoughts. The roof of her cabin had groaned under the weight of the snow, the wind's shrieking howls making her wonder if it might cave in at any moment. But each time she would push those thoughts away. She had built this home. She had prepared. She had placed her faith in the land, and so far it had held. Martha climbed to the trapdoor and, as she had done each day since the storm began, lowered herself down into the barn. The air was cool and still, not frigid but calm. Clementine and Jasper stood where she had left them, munching lazily on hay. Daisy was up on her feet, flicking her tail in the calm light. They had been cared for, kept warm, and most importantly, kept alive. No fear, no panic. Just the quiet sound of chewing and the soft shuffle of hooves. The thought brought Martha a rare smile, though she quickly wiped it away, feeling the weight of the situation all over again. Her work was far from finished. The storm had been cruel, and now, in its aftermath, there was much to be done. The snow was still deep, and her path to the cabin was a challenge in itself. But those were just obstacles, temporary ones, in a world that had already tried to bury her under the weight of its own fury. She checked the barn's ventilation once more, the shaft still clear, air circulating perfectly. The earth, as she had known it would, had kept its promise. The barn had stayed warm enough for her animals to survive. She could feel the steady hum of success in the quiet of the barn, but it was only part of the larger story. She moved toward the ramp that led to the outside. The ground was still hard, packed with snow, but she could feel the thaw beginning. The storm had not just been a physical battle, it had been a test of everything she had learned in the past year. A test of her resolve, of her vision. A test of the earth's resilience and her ability to listen to it. Outside, the snow had piled up, but there was still a sense of stillness. The drifts were massive, reaching over the roof of her cabin, forming mountains of white across the prairie. It was hard to see any trace of the world she had once known. The trees were buried, the fences non-existent, the earth itself swallowed whole by the storm's rage. For the first time, the isolation of the plains felt complete. There was no way out. No way forward except through. She grabbed the shovel from the cabin and made her way out into the snow, her boots crunching in the deep drifts. It was slow, back-breaking work to clear the path. The snow had compacted and frozen into hard slabs. She had to chip away at it bit by bit until she had a narrow passage to the barn. But it wasn't just about clearing a path. It was about reclaiming control over what had been taken. As she shoveled, Martha's mind wandered back to the others, the ranchers who had mocked her project. She thought of Finch, the man who had warned her against the folly of building underground. His barns, the symbols of traditional wisdom, had fallen. His livestock had been lost. The proud barn that had stood tall in the open air had been no match for the storm. And yet here she was. Her animals were healthy, safe. Her barn had weathered the storm. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the snow, Martha finished clearing the path to the barn. Her body ached with the effort, but she felt an immense sense of pride. She had survived. Her animals had survived. In a world that had tried to bury her, she had found a way to rise above it. She stopped at the edge of the ramp, looking back at the barn. It was just a mound now, a quiet hill in the landscape. But it was more than that. It was a symbol, a testament to everything she had done, everything she had fought for. It was proof that sometimes the ground beneath your feet holds more than just dirt. It holds life. The next few days were spent working to clear the rest of the cabin and the surrounding area. Slowly, as the snow began to melt, the world returned to some semblance of normalcy. The storm had passed, but its effects lingered. Martha was ready for the next challenge, whatever it might be. One morning, as she worked to clear the last of the snow from her cabin roof, a figure appeared on the horizon. It was a man, his shape barely visible against the bright, snow-covered landscape. She paused, wiping the sweat from her brow, and watched him approach. It was Alistair Finch. He rode up on a horse, his face weathered and worn, his expression unreadable. He dismounted slowly, his eyes scanning the landscape before settling on Martha. She stood, silent, waiting. "I lost them," he said quietly, his voice devoid of its usual authority. "My cattle, my barn, they're gone." Martha didn't speak at first. She simply nodded, the weight of the storm still heavy in the air between them. Finch stood before her, his shoulders slumped in defeat. "I didn't believe you," he said, looking down at his boots. "I didn't listen." Martha watched him, her heart softening just a little. There was no joy in seeing him humbled. She had never wanted to prove him wrong. She just wanted to survive, to protect her animals. After a long moment of silence, Finch finally looked up at her. "How?" he asked. "How did you do it?" Martha took a deep breath. "I listened to the land," she said simply. "I didn't fight it, I worked with it." Finch didn't respond right away. Instead, he looked over at the barn, still standing strong, and nodded slowly. There was a quiet understanding in his eyes. He didn't have to ask any more questions. Martha's barn had done more than protect her animals. It had changed something in him, too. The respect between them was silent, unspoken. And for the first time, Martha didn't feel the need to explain. She simply turned back to the ramp, ready to continue her work. The earth had held. The barn had held. And in the end, that was all that mattered. The thaw came slowly, creeping across the plains like the first hints of spring. The world that had been buried beneath layers of snow and ice for so long began to show signs of life again. The snowdrifts melted, revealing the battered landscape beneath. The once pristine white world became a brown, soggy expanse, the scars of the storm etched into the earth. But Martha didn't mind. She had endured, she had survived. As the days passed, the town slowly started to recover from the storm. People emerged from their homes, blinking in the harsh daylight, picking their way through the snow and debris. The damage was extensive: barns flattened, livestock lost, fences torn apart. The great blizzard had claimed its victims, and its aftermath had left a wake of destruction. Martha had already begun to repair what she could. She cleared away the remaining snow from the entrance to the barn, made sure her animals had enough food, and checked the ventilation shafts to ensure the barn remained secure. Her 2 horses, Clementine and Jasper, and Daisy the cow, were still healthy, still strong. They had survived the storm without so much as a scratch. It was a victory that could not be understated. The word about Martha's underground barn spread quickly, though not in the way she had expected. At first, it was whispered behind closed doors, a quiet murmur that gradually became louder. Some people called her Crazy Martha, a name that had once been an insult. But now there was a different tone when they spoke of her, a mixture of awe and disbelief. Her idea, once mocked, had proven to be the key to survival. She had done what no one else had thought possible. Finch, who had once scorned her methods, was now a man humbled. His ranch had suffered terribly during the storm. His magnificent barn, built in the traditional way, had collapsed under the weight of the snow. His cattle were lost, but Martha's barn, hidden beneath the earth, had stood firm, protecting her animals from the worst the storm could throw at it. The difference between their fates was undeniable. Finch, who had once stood at the pinnacle of ranching success, now found himself looking to Martha for answers. As spring arrived and the earth began to warm, so did the people's attitudes toward Martha. The once constant whispers became something else: questions, curiosity, and respect. Martha's way of life had not only endured the storm, but it had thrived in it. The lesson had been learned, albeit too late for many. One by one, the ranchers began to visit Martha. They came to ask about her underground barn, how it had worked, how it had kept her animals alive when their own barns had failed. Martha answered them patiently, explaining the principles she had used: the insulation of the earth, the ventilation shafts, the thick sod roof that had protected her from the snow. She didn't claim to have known it would work perfectly. She had simply done what she had to do. She had listened to the land. In the months that followed, other ranchers began to build barns like hers. They dug into the sides of hills, creating bank barns with walls protected by the earth. They built dugouts, half-buried structures with thick sod roofs, mimicking Martha's design. What had once been seen as a crazy idea became the new tradition. The survival techniques that Martha had pioneered in her isolation spread across the plains, transforming the way people thought about building shelters in the face of nature's fury. Martha never sought recognition. She never asked for thanks or praise. She didn't want to be a hero. She simply wanted to survive, to keep her animals safe. And in that, she had succeeded. The respect she earned came quietly, not in grand gestures but in the small nods from ranchers when they passed her homestead, or the way they stopped to watch her animals graze near the gentle slope of her barn. She had earned their respect not by force or by standing tall, but by understanding when to bend, when to seek shelter, and when to listen. Years passed, and Martha grew older. Her movements slowed, but her eyes remained sharp, still full of that quiet, steady determination that had carried her through the worst of the storm. She would sit on the porch her husband had built, watching the seasons change, the land shifting beneath her feet. The barn, now weathered by time, still stood firm. The grass had grown over the entrance, blending it into the landscape. It was no longer an oddity, no longer an underground structure that set her apart. It had become a part of the land, a natural feature of the prairie. In the end, Martha's life was one of quiet routine. She lived alone, but she wasn't lonely. Her animals were her companions, and the land itself was a steady presence in her life. The lessons of the great 1890 blizzard lived on, not just in the design of the barns, but in the hearts and minds of the people who had learned to listen to the earth. She had outlasted the storm. She had survived not by fighting nature, but by working with it. And in the end, that was all that mattered. Martha never became a legend in the traditional sense. There were no grand statues built in her honor, no songs sung about her. But in the hearts of those who had known her, she was something greater. She was a symbol of resilience, of quiet strength, of a woman who had listened to the land and had, against all odds, survived. And when the winter came again, as it always did, the people who built their barns, those who had once called her crazy, would look at her homestead and remember. They would remember the woman who understood the winter, the woman who had listened to the land, and the woman who had survived when all seemed lost. Martha's legacy was not just in her barn or her animals. It was in the quiet, simple truth that survival is not always about standing tall. Sometimes, it's about listening, adapting, and finding shelter where others might not even think to look. Not without a fight.